Homage to the Buddha, homage to the Dharma, homage to the Sangha. Good evening. So for tonight's talk, I started thinking about what is it that I want to bring forward? What is it that I want to share with folks? And I really just started working with a phrase from Dogen's Genjo Koan that's very famous. I'm sure most of you have heard it, that phrase of to study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be enlightened by the myriad things. So I have some words I'd like to share with you about that phrase, that particular teaching, but I'm also wondering if it would be useful for me to read Genjo Koan. It's 5 pages, which is shorter than some of our book readings. But it might give a little bit of a context to this phrase. So I'll read it. And for those of you listening, just let your body be at ease, sit in a comfortable position, and just perhaps enter that mind of meditation and just let the words wash through you. There's no need to try to figure it out or grab onto particular imagery, but just listen to the words. And then I'll come back to this particular phrase that caught my attention earlier. So this is the first fascicle in the Shobogenzo, Dogen's big collection of works. And it's titled Genjo Koan. When all dharmas are the Buddha Dharma, there is delusion and realization, practice, life and death, Buddhas and living beings. When the 10,000 dharmas are without fixed self, there is no delusion and no realization, no Buddhas and no living beings, no birth and no death. Since the Buddha way by nature goes beyond the dichotomy of abundance and deficiency, there is arising and perishing, delusion and realization, living beings and Buddhas. Therefore, flowers fall even though we love them. Weeds grow even though we dislike them. Conveying oneself toward all things to carry out practice enlightenment is delusion. All things coming and carrying out practice enlightenment through the self is realization. Those who greatly realize delusion are Buddhas. Those who are greatly deluded in realization are living beings. Furthermore, there are those who attain realization beyond realization, and those who are deluded within delusion. When Buddhas are truly Buddhas, they don't need to perceive they are Buddhas. However, they are enlightened Buddhas, and they continue actualizing Buddha. In seeing color and hearing sound with body and mind, although we perceive them intimately, the perception is not like reflections in a mirror or the moon and water. When one side is illuminated, the other is dark. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be verified by all things. To be verified by all things is to let the body and mind of the self and the body and mind of others drop off. There is a trace of realization that cannot be grasped. We endlessly express this ungraspable trace of realization. When one first seeks the Dharma, one strays far from the boundary of the Dharma. When the Dharma is correctly transmitted to the self, one is immediately an original person. If one riding in a boat watches the coast, one mistakenly perceives the coast is moving. If one watches the boat in relation to the surface of the water, then one notices that the boat is moving. Similarly, when we perceive the body and mind in a confused way and grasp all things with a discriminating mind, we mistakenly think that the self-nature of the mind is permanent. When we intimately practice and return right here, it is clear that all things have no fixed self. Firewood becomes ash. Ash cannot become firewood again. However, we should not view ash as after and firewood as before. We should know that firewood dwells in the Dharma position of firewood and has its own before and after. Although before and after exist, past and future are cut off. Ash stays in the position of ash, with its own before and after. As firewood never becomes firewood again after it has burned to ash, there is no return to living after a person dies. However, in Buddha Dharma, it is an unchanged tradition not to say that life becomes death. Therefore, we call it no arising. It is the established way of Buddhas turning the Dharma wheel not to say that death becomes life. Therefore, we call it no perishing. Life is a position in time. Death is also a position in time. This is like winter and spring. We don't think that winter becomes spring, and we don't say that spring becomes summer. When a person attains realization, it is like the moon's reflection in water. The moon never becomes wet. The water is never disturbed. Although the moon is a vast and great light, it is reflected in a drop of water. The whole moon and even the whole sky are reflected in a drop of dew on a blade of grass. Realization does not destroy the person, as the moon does not make a hole in the water. The person does not obstruct realization, as a drop of dew does not obstruct the moon and sky. The depth is the same as the height. To investigate the significance of the length and brevity of time, we should consider whether the water is great or small, and understand the size of the moon and the sky. When the Dharma has not yet fully penetrated body and mind, one thinks one is already filled with it. When the Dharma fills body and mind, one thinks something is still lacking. For example, when we sail a boat into the ocean beyond sight of land, and our eyes scan the horizon in the four directions, it simply looks like a circle. No other shape appears. This great ocean, however, is neither round nor square. It has inexhaustible characteristics. To a fish, it looks like a palace. To a heavenly being, a jeweled necklace. To us, as far as our eye can see, it looks like a circle. All the myriad things are like this. Within the dusty world and beyond, there are innumerable aspects and characteristics. We only see or grasp as far as the power of our eye of study and practice can see. When we listen to the reality of myriad things, we must know that there are inexhaustible characteristics in both ocean and mountains, and there are many other worlds in the four directions. This is true not only in the external world, but also right under our feet or within a single drop of water. When a fish swims, no matter how far it swims, it doesn't reach the end of the water. When a bird flies, no matter how high it flies, it cannot reach the end of the sky. When the bird's need or the fish's need is great, the range is large. When the need is small, the range is small. In this way, each fish and each bird uses the whole of space and vigorously acts in every place. However, if a bird departs from the sky or a fish leaves the water, it immediately dies. We should know that for a fish, water is life. For a bird, sky is life. A bird is life, a fish is life. Life is a bird, life is a fish. And we should go beyond this. There is practice enlightenment. This is the way of living beings. Therefore, if there are fish that would swim or birds that would fly only after investigating the entire ocean or sky, they would find neither path nor place. When we make this very place our own, our practice becomes the actualization of reality. When we make this path our own, our activity naturally becomes actualized reality. This path, this place, is neither big nor small, neither self nor others. It has not existed before this minute, nor has it come into existence now. Therefore, the reality of all things is thus. In the same way, when a person engages in practice enlightenment in the Buddha way, as the person realizes one Dharma, the person permeates that Dharma. As the person encounters one practice, the person fully practices that practice. For this, there is a place and a path. The boundary of the known is not clear. This is because the known, which appears limited, is born and practiced simultaneously with the complete penetration of the Buddha Dharma. We should not think that what we have attained is conceived by ourselves and known by our discriminating mind. Although complete enlightenment is immediately actualized, its intimacy is such that it does not necessarily form as a view. In fact, viewing is not something fixed. Zen Master Baoche of Mount Magu was waving a fan. A monk approached him and asked, "The nature of wind is ever present and permeates everywhere. Why are you waving a fan?" The master said, "You only know that the wind's nature is ever present. You don't know that it permeates everywhere." The monk said, "How does the wind permeate everywhere?" The master just continued waving the fan. The monk bowed deeply. The genuine experience of Buddha Dharma and the vital path that has been correctly transmitted are like this. To say we should not wave a fan because the nature of wind is ever present, and that we should feel the wind even when we don't wave a fan, is to know neither ever presence nor the wind's nature. Since the wind's nature is ever present, the wind of the Buddha's family enables us to realize the gold of the great earth and to transform the water of the long river into cream. The first chapter of Shobogenzo, the true Dharma Eye Treasury. Ginjo Koan, Actualizing Reality. This was written in mid-autumn in the first year of Tempuku era, 1233, and given to my lay disciple Yokoshu, who lived in Shinzei of Kyushu, compiled in the fourth year of Kensho, 1252, translated by Shohaku Okumura. So that's Ginjo Koan. And for many Zen practitioners, there is a warm feeling that arises in hearing it because it's one that is often studied. But that one phrase, to study the Buddha way, is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be enlightened by myriad things. Or as Shohaku Okumura puts it, to be verified by the myriad things. This is one that comes up a lot and is quoted a lot. I think at one point I even saw it on some, like a mug or a notebook in a grocery store, and it just brought me up short to see a Dogen quote at New Seasons, but maybe I shouldn't have been surprised because it was New Seasons. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. We learn Buddha's teachings. We learn how to sit. We learn how to behave ethically and follow the precepts. And in the beginning, it can seem abstract. Teachings, ideas, suggestions, advice, words, something new, something different. At some point, though, we begin to see ourselves within those teachings. Or perhaps we begin to measure ourselves against those teachings. Where am I in this? There is something very important in knowing ourselves completely. Knowing our habits, knowing our patterns, knowing our fears, knowing our hopes, knowing what's important. And there's something very important about knowing ourselves completely with self-acceptance. It's one thing to know ourselves completely with self-judgment. That's easier. And I think oftentimes that's what we encounter first, is to know ourselves with self-judgment, especially when we're working with precepts or Buddhist teachings. Oh, these are the ways I fall short. These are the ways I don't measure up. It's another thing entirely to know ourselves with self-acceptance. Oh, these are my patterns. These are my habits. Oh, when this thing arises, I'll probably respond that way. Okay, I can meet that with care. Knowing ourselves completely with self-acceptance makes for good mental health, and it makes for good spiritual practice. And sometimes it takes a while to bring ourselves towards good spiritual health. to accept things that might want changing, and to provide ourselves with loving kindness for old hurts or fears, resentments. Imagine what it is to have a resentment and still care for yourself, knowing that you hold resentment. It's a sweet thing. It allows us to grow and change if we are willing to grow and change, if we are willing to be that vulnerable with ourselves to grow and change. But when we look at this phrase, to study the self, how do we study the self? How do we do this thing? Especially when we already think we know who we are. Most of us have a sense of who we are. This is the self that we walk around with every day, that goes to the grocery store and stands in line, or that rolls their eyes at the gas pump as the numbers keep rolling up and up and up and up and up. And oh, maybe there's tension in the body too. I know who I am. But then we practice. We practice Zazen. We get to see ourselves in a little bit of a different light when we have an opportunity to reflect on our narrative, or when we get to notice the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are or how our day has been. We learn to study the self in term student, where we see ourselves reflected in the others around us. When we hear stories that are unique to each person and yet common amongst all of us. We study the self when we encounter our Buddhist studies class, encountering new Dharma or new ways of relating to Dharma. Oh, what is this? Oh, why can't I figure that out? Oh, I got this one. Wait, what? Ah, the mind works in funny ways. We study the self when we reflect on our relationships, when we engage in contemplation, or when we do work practice or body practice or art practice. Huh. When I do art practice, I draw stick figures. Well, I don't like that. Well, okay, I draw stick figures. Accepting the self with judgment, accepting the self with loving kindness, compassion. We learn. How do we even define a self? Like I said, we all have a sense of self that we walk around with. But what is that self? In Buddhism, you can find a couple of different ways to define the self. Maybe more than a couple, maybe a few. We can talk about the self perhaps as the 5 skandhas: form, sensation, perception, formation, consciousness, that list in the Heart Sutra. These things that are bound together to create a being. Or perhaps we can define a self as the various consciousnesses that Buddhist philosophy describe, whether they're the sense consciousness or the manas or the alaya vijnana, the storehouse consciousness. Perhaps we define ourself as our body and mind, not separating those 2 words, but imagining them as a whole. Perhaps we define a self as that principle within us that organizes our interior space, or that part of us that claims that pronoun I. Perhaps that shifts from narrative to narrative, that sense of I, or that sense of self. But I'm very curious how you define yourself. Who are you? What do you value? Sometime in Zazen, maybe not today or tomorrow, but at some point, consider asking yourself, I'm a person who values what? See what comes up. Or something, something, something is important to me. What is that something, something, something? What is important to you? Or I find meaning in. Where do you find your meaning? All of these things help us discover who we are. Sometimes we don't think about it. A lot of times we don't think about what's important to us until something very shocking happens to shock us out of our regular narrative, whether it's an accident or a life-changing event or um, even just a close scare on the freeway. Sometimes we can encounter that sense of like, ooh, and all of a sudden there's that crystal clear knowing of what's important. Hopefully we don't have to have those encounters to discover what's important to us. But also we don't exist in a vacuum. Part of who we are can be seen in who we surround ourselves with. The people that we encounter in our lives also help make up who we are. And this is where Sangha or community can become important. We go in and out of overlapping communities, whether those communities are family, either nuclear family or extended family or chosen family, our workplace community, our spiritual communities, social communities, our city, our town, our state, our country, our culture, our global community, our shared human nature, our shared life energy. We're connected to the whole world around us, and we're not separate from it. Hopefully you heard some of that in Genjo Koan. To study the self is to forget the self. How do we forget the self? How do we do that? I mean, I'm right here. We're right here. Like, here we are. Ta-da! On Zoom, in our homes. We're right here. We tend to focus on our own skillful or unskillful behaviors, developing our generosity, our morality, vigor, patience, concentration, wisdom, those paramitas that we uphold and value in Buddhism. We're trying to engage with right action and the rest of the Eightfold Path. That doesn't sound like forgetting the self. We're trying to figure out how to do this whole Buddhist thing. But at some point, something relaxes. Forgetting the self is functioning from a sense of no self. It's functioning without anxiety about, am I doing it right? Or am I a good Zen person? It's just doing. Sometimes we see this in work practice. It's no longer me weeding the garden, it's just the garden being weeded. Floors get swept, beds get made. Sometimes in the temple, we fall into a funny way of speaking really as a way to counter imperative voice or giving orders to other people. So instead of asking, will you start the dishwasher? We might say the dishwasher wants to be started. We might say, please. The floor wants sweeping. The bed wants to be made. We take ourselves out of our speech, not as a way to make people invisible or to negate their efforts, but instead to change the way we relate to each other. It's hard to explain this without being immersed in it, but it lessens the angst and frustrations about shared chores. Forgetting the self is simply being fully engaged in whatever is happening. If we were not forgetting the self, there might be worry, or there might be self-judgment about our performance in whatever we're doing. Forgetting the self is simple response, catching a teacup as it falls, smiling in response to a smile from a person passing on the street, relaxing completely as you watch a sunset. We forget the self, and then we manifest a self. We forget the self and we embody a self. Moment, moment, moment. And this fluidity is our daily life. With diligent practice, we get better at noticing what's going on internally, and we get better at noticing how we impact and are impacted by the conditions around us. To forget the self is to be enlightened by the myriad things, to be verified by the myriad things. Do we even notice when this happens? Kyogen used to call it a moment of grace, a moment of freedom. In Zen, we talk about enlightenment. We don't talk about enlightenment as a permanent state. We rarely talk about enlightenment at all. It's too easy to think of it as a thing and try to chase after it, or try to catch it, or try to push ourselves into that little container that we've labeled enlightenment. It's a mistake to think of it as a static state. It's something we can brush up against and then back into samsara we go, which is really a poor way to put it, because stating it that way makes us one thing and enlightenment something else. We're not separate. Us, we, and enlightenment are not different things. But language can be tricky and limiting. Having those words, I, we, us, self, enlightenment. I'm here, enlightenment is there. It's just an artifact of language. So we're not separate from enlightenment, but a lot of time we have a lot of stuff in our way that prevents us from realizing that prevents us from encountering it in a felt, embodied way. In a way that enlightenment is our natural state, but we do so many convoluted things to blind ourselves from it. Desires and reactivities and insistences that things go a particular way, anger, greed, delusion. Our efforts, our personal efforts, go into studying the Buddha way and studying the self. The rest of it happens when we get out of our own way. Moments of unexpected ease, a sudden overwhelm of beauty, a sense of expansion or connectedness that's larger than we usually assume ourselves to be. Don't worry about it, but don't do nothing either. Otherwise, it's so easy to be caught in indulging our delusions. So I would encourage you to find that balance between effort and non-effort, between leaning into this studying the Buddha way and studying the self. And let that forgetting the self arise of its own accord. Dogen said it much more eloquently with his fishes and birds, with his boats on the water. And I am indebted to him for bringing this teaching into being, and for us, hundreds and hundreds of years later, still working with his thoughts and his ideas and his articulation. And I am deeply indebted to the translators who have translated these works from Japanese. But that's what I have for you tonight. And I'm curious to hear your responses to either Genjo Koan as a whole, or from the little snippet that I brought forward.